Alright, I got an interesting one for you today. First, we're going to do some background on William Shakespeare, and by background, I am going to offer a theory that I hinted at the end of my last video, that Shakespeare, or at least Shakespeare how we think about him, never actually existed, and he never wrote any of his plays. And then I am going to give you a little introduction to one of Shakespeare's plays, the one that we are going to be reading, the thing we're ending our semester with, King Lear. So here we go. First things first, the theory that Shakespeare didn't write his plays is called the anti-Stratfordian theory. Shakespeare was born at Stratford-on-Avon, so anti-Stratfordian means against the belief that he wrote the plays. Let me get this out of the way first. I'm not a crazy person. My mother had me tested. Big Bang Theory reference there. This is a legitimate, people believe this idea. It's been around since at least 1848, if not earlier. In all fairness, let me make this abundantly clear. Most people believe that William Shakespeare, that we know and think about, was the author of all his plays and all his poems. But there are enough people out there are enough anti-Stratfordians out there where this theory isn't whoop whoop lunatic crazy. Theory goes something like this. Yes, there was probably a real person named William Shakespeare, but either he was at the front, or he used his name to cover for somebody or a group of people who actually wrote the plays. Now, why would somebody do this? Well, if it was a big company, it's easier to get funding if it's just one person, so he was maybe the front man for the big company of people who wrote the plays. If it was somebody else, and at the end of this presentation, I'll give you a list of some of the people who might be the real Shakespeare. A lot of them were upper class, wealthy people. Shakespeare was not. We'll get into that in a little bit. Writing plays was seen as kind of a low-class, crappy profession. Give you an example, the theater was usually in the bad, shady part of town, and the people who hung out around theaters were seen as kind of disreputable. For the longest time, traveling theater companies moved from town to town, and when you can move from town to town, you can do some real shady things like rob people and all sorts of shady stuff, and actors and playwrights had that sort of a reputation. When they were in town, they were in, like I said, the bad part of town, where bear baiting, where basically people would poke a bear and throw dogs into bears and bet on how long it would take the bear to kill the dog. Walking around theaters were something called orange girls. For a dime, you could have an orange. They'd sell you an orange. For a quarter, you could have the orange girl, if you know what I mean. So being associated with plays in the theater, not something someone in the upper class would necessarily want to do. So that's important to understand. Here's reason number one, that me and a bunch of other people are skeptical about whether Shakespeare as we know him existed. We know nothing about him, next to nothing. No clue when he was born. Yes, his birthday is celebrated as April 23rd, 1564, but that's totally made up. Why? Because he died on April 23rd, 1616, and for some reason people like symmetry. As for his death, no clue how, what, just no clue about it. He died. That's all we know. There is no evidence whatsoever that his mother or father could write. Does that mean that he couldn't write? Well, no, that's not the most convincing piece of evidence. Shakespeare's parents signed their name with a mark, which is what people who couldn't write did. Here, something's a little bit more convincing. Shakespeare's daughters signed their names with a mark, and you would think if their daddy was the greatest playwright in the history of the English language, he would take the time to teach them how to write. I think that's a pretty persuasive bit of evidence. Reason number two, I told you he was born at Stratford-on-Avon, which was known for sheep, like raising sheep, killing sheep, it was sheep. It was sheep country. His dad was a glove maker who made gloves out of, take a guess, sheep hide. To me, this is the most convincing thing that Shakespeare, as we know him, didn't exist. How is it possible that a guy raised in sheep country, in a time when most people did not travel, you were lucky to go 30 miles from where you were born, how could someone raised there have the knowledge it took to write these detailed, incredibly specific, incredibly nuanced plays about life in foreign countries? He's got plays set in Italy. He's got plays set in Denmark, Hamlet. Court life, the life of the upper class. How could a guy who comes from the hills of sheepland know about court life, not only in England, but in other countries? Know things the aristocracy did, like falconry, sending falcons around, lawn, bowling, hunting. Like, how could someone who never touched the aristocracy know these things, and not just in a passing way, but in a really detailed, really intimate, really familiar way? I think an aristocrat could, and most of the people who were proposed as the real Shakespeare were aristocrats. Oh yeah, commoners, people who come from like the hill country and the sheep country in Shakespeare's plays, are portrayed horribly. Go read Midsummer Night's Dream, and all the common folk there are bumbling morons. I think if you came from those people, you would portray them in a better light. Let's talk about Shakespeare's education. Not one documented bit of evidence that he went to school. Now, to be fair, the school that he would have went to, which is called King's New School, records totally gone. No records, like no record of anybody who went there. So in theory, I guess he could have been registered there. Here's the thing. We absolutely know the curriculum that was taught at this school. He would have learned Latin, rhetoric, which is the skill of argument, classical literature, but all at a really low basic level, nothing fancy. Shakespeare's plays contain 29,000 different words and display a knowledge and familiarity of language and literature way, way beyond the rudimentary level he would have learned at King's New School, like leaps and bounds above it. I think that's a convincing point. Here's another one. No letters of Shakespeare survive, or manuscripts like, manuscripts of his plays survive. Not one. Not one. We have them in folios, which are printed editions, but no original manuscripts. We have 6 of Shakespeare's signatures on other things, each written in, again, these are not my words, an illiterate scrawl. Not in a way anyone who was familiar with writing would have signed them. Oh yeah, and there's this. Those 6 times he signed his name, very rarely spelt the same way twice. Sometimes like you get Shake-Speare, sometimes you get Shake-Spear, sometimes you get that. Never any consistency. You would think someone who would write and would sign their name with a degree, would just sign their name the same way. Some of these signatures come from like documents from the world of theater, but nothing that says he ever wrote for the theater. As an actor, sure. As a shareholder, sure. As an investor, but not one survives that links him to anything remotely associated with writing. And then there's this, and I think this is pretty convincing. In his will, which is very detailed and very specific, like it's itemized down to his bed, his trinkets, his pillows, everything. You know what there's no evidence he owned at all? Books. It does not appear that he owned one book, not at all, even a little bit. You'd think the most amazing writer in the history of the English language would own at least one book. You know what else the will doesn't mention? Not one of the plays that were unpublished when he died. Not one play. Not one play mentioned in his will, and there is no record of any sort of public funeral, memorial, or anything. And you'd think someone with this reputation would, his passing would be at least worth, a note someplace. So, taken all together, I think, personally, this guy, Shakespeare, the historical Shakespeare, no way he wrote these plays. Who did? Well, maybe it was a collective of people, a group of people working together. Sir Francis Bacon, who was a philosopher, scholar, writer living around the time of Shakespeare, he's often put forth as a candidate. Is he the most convincing candidate? No, but if you ever watch the TV show on the History Channel, The Curse of Oak Island, there's this island off in the North Atlantic where some treasure is buried. Some people would tell you that the original manuscripts of Shakespeare's plays are buried on Oak Island, and I thought that was absolutely insane. But if you watch the show, they found traces of mercury buried deep, 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 deep below in this island. Why is that relevant? Because Sir Francis Bacon thought that the best way to preserve manuscripts were in mercury. I'm going to skip Edward de Vere for a second. Christopher Marlowe, he's my personal favorite. I think he is actually the best playwright of the English Renaissance. He wrote Dr. Faust, a couple other plays. The thing is, he had a reputation of his own as a playwright, so why would he have to go masquerading around as Shakespeare? Well, being a playwright was Marlowe's day job. His night job was actually, you could look this up, as being like a spy or secret agent. And supposedly he was knifed to death in a bar fight, but no one ever, his body, something happened to it. It disappeared. Something happened to his body. And some people tell you he went on writing under the name as Shakespeare. These two here, Edward de Vere and William Stanley, like I said, they're Earl of Oxford, Earl of Derby. Like I said, upper class aristocrats who, maybe if they enjoyed writing, wouldn't want their name associated with all the bad stuff we talked about. Edward de Vere was the old school favorite, still kind of compelling. I can't go into all the details here, but a lot of the events in Shakespeare's plays line up with his life. He had a relative who might have been the basis for somebody in one of Shakespeare's plays. William Stanley, the Earl of Derby, he's the current leading contender. Part of it was based on his first name is William and his last initial is S, but I promise it goes way, way deeper than that. A lot of the characters in Shakespeare's plays line up with people in his life. We do have some of his writing that survived, and it's pretty similar to Shakespeare's, and I'm pretty sure I'm right about this. I think he once performed in a high school play, or a high school play or a college play, something like that, and he played a character who had a spear, and he shook that spear, and from then on his nickname was Shakespeare or something like that. Again, I'm not totally sure about that. It was in a book that I read a while ago. So those are the leading contenders, and thank you for indulging me on that. I think it's interesting. Because he has such a huge reputation, but it's not 100% sure that Shakespeare was Shakespeare. Okay, putting a pause in that, let's introduce King Lear. And yes, that's Patrick Stewart, Captain Picard, Professor X from the X-Men, and that's Ian McKellen, Gandalf, and Magneto. They both played King Lear. They're both Shakespearean trained actors, and I think it's interesting that two of the biggest, I'm a huge sci-fi fan in case you haven't realized by now, two of the most iconic actors in science fiction movies were Shakespearean trained, and they both played King Lear. And yes, this is Patrick Stewart again. That's him as Lear, and this is him in The King of Texas, which is a really, really terrible modernization of Shakespeare. And actually, a lot of movies are modernizations of Shakespeare. The one that's most popular, but you might not even know it, if you ever saw The Lion King, it's Hamlet. It's the exact same plot as Hamlet. Trying to think of other ones that. This movie called My Own Private Idaho with. I think it was like DiCaprio's first movie is Henry IV. Point being, a lot of movies are taken from, if you ever seen the Kevin Smith movie Mallrats, it's Midsummer Night's Dream set in the mall. But, well, let me go back for a second. Very, 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 for as much of a reputation as Shakespeare has, very, very few of his plots, Shakespeare, whoever you want to say it was, are original 100% to himself. A lot of his plays come from other sources. The only plays that were all completely hit, there's only two of them, and the only really good one is The Tempest. A lot of his other famous plays, Romeo and Juliet, for example, it came from the story of Paramus and Thisbe. It's an ancient Greek story where a guy and a girl fall in love from opposite families. They end up meeting at a wall, and instead of one drinking poison, one gets killed, one gets eaten. A lion shows up for whatever reason. The girl runs away, drops her scarf. The guy shows up later. He sees the lion with the girl's scarf in the mouth, assumes that she's dead. He kills himself, and then she kills herself. Hamlet was based on a Danish epic. Macbeth was a real person. Julius Caesar. So, point being, Shakespeare had very few original plots. King Lear is not an original plot. It came from a bunch of different sources. One is, there was a real actual King Lear. It was spelled a little bit differently. Don't know much about him. We know it from a historical account by this guy, Geoffrey of Monmouth. If you think back to the early part of this course, the original British inhabitants of the British island were the Celtics. probably Lear was a Celtic king of Britain. The story you're going to read supposedly actually happened to this real king. Did it? We have no idea, but probably not. But it is worth noting that there was a King Lear in the history of Britain. All right, this is a big one. Anxiety over transfer of power from Elizabeth I to James I. This was going on around 1603 when Shakespeare was writing the play. Elizabeth I was an amazing queen. She was the Virgin Queen. Great queen, amazing, but the Virgin Queen. Problem with being a Virgin Queen, you die without any successors. I mean, if you had kids, obviously it would go to your first male heir. But when Elizabeth I died without an heir, people were freaking out because they didn't know who was going to be king, how this would resolve. They didn't know what would happen. They were pretty sure there was going to be civil war. Why were they sure there was going to be a civil war? Because it had happened before in this thing called the War of the Roses. The houses of York and the houses of Lancaster both thought that they should become king, and a civil war erupted that was so bloody and so violent, it basically became the inspiration for Game of Thrones. So yeah, it was a pretty nasty situation. Long story short, eventually they found a guy, James I, who had enough of a claim to being king that people were okay with it. But there was this overwhelming feeling that they had dodged a bullet. And this is going to become relevant when you read Act 1 of the play, where Lear doesn't have any sons. He only has daughters. I mean, when it's sons, it's pretty clear that it goes to the first male heir. But when you have daughters, things get a little bit sketchier. And as we'll see, Lear's trying to retire, which we'll talk about that in a little bit. Here's something else that contributed to King Lear. 2 court cases during the time. Some things don't change. People are fascinated by court cases. Remember, the OJ case was a huge case when I was in high school. But people still are really interested in controversial court cases. And one of the most controversial court cases during Shakespeare's time was something called the case of Sir Brian Annesley and his daughters. Long story short, Sir Brian was a wealthy knight. He had 3 daughters. 2 of them really, really wanted to get their hands on Daddy's money. Daddy wasn't dying anytime soon, so they tried to have him declare, we call it legally insane or mentally incompetent, so they could get their hands on their father's money. One daughter, whose name is Cordell, you'll realize why that's important when you start reading King Lear, was the good daughter and stood up and said, no, my dad's not insane, he's mentally sound. My two sisters are basically just gold diggers. But it was a real court case. 2 bad daughters, 1 good daughter named Cordell. You'll see when you start reading how that influenced the play. Another court case at the time was the Lord Mayor of London and his sons. It's way too complicated again in here, but it's basically the same thing as what happened to Sir Brian Annesley with his daughters, but with sons. And as we'll talk about, I guess in a little bit, one of Shakespeare's geniuses is running 2 plots together. The case of Sir Brian and his daughters becomes King Lear and his daughters. The case of the Lord Mayor of London becomes the parallel plot in King Lear, Gloucester and his 2 sons. And here, to make things a little bit more interesting, there already was a King Lear play. Somebody beat Shakespeare to the punch. Some people say the original play was written by Shakespeare too, but I don't buy that at all. Point being, there was a King Lear play that pre-exists the King Lear play that you're going to read. Was it different from Shakespeare's? Well, the end is very, 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 very radically night and day, like elephants and glockenspiels different. But we'll talk about that when we get closer to the end of our play. What I'd like to talk about now is some of the big themes of our version of King Lear. One of those big themes is this idea of cosmic justice. We'd like to tell ourselves, it makes us feel good that the good guys always win and get rewarded, and bad guys ultimately get punished, get what's coming to them, get what they deserve. Pretty much every summer blockbuster superhero movie is predicated on that. Here's the thing, though. That's not life. That's not the way things work out. Sometimes the bad guys win. Sometimes terrible, awful things happen to good people. there is no, one of the messages of this play, there is no such thing as cosmic justice. If there was such a thing as cosmic justice, the Saints would not have lost the NFC Championship game 2 years ago. If there was such a thing as cosmic justice, there would be no such thing as the Kardashians. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. Sometimes bad people win and good and bad things happen to good people. The message of the play is there is no cosmic justice. God's fate, the universe, whatever you want to call it, they doesn't care. Life isn't fair. The bad guys win sometimes. Terrible things happen to good people, and that's just life. Keep that in mind when we start talking about how Shakespeare's ending differs from the original ending. Another big theme, kingship. The nature of kingship, limits of kingship, what a king can do. Britain has been a country for a long time by this point, by the time Shakespeare's writing. And they've had kings for a long time, but they're still trying to figure out a couple things. Like we said, what happens when a king or queen dies without a clear heir? This is also going to come up in the very, very first act of our play, King Lear. Act 1, Scene 1, even. When King Lear tries to do two things that it's not exactly clear a king can even do. You'll see what those things are when you start reading the play, but keep that in mind. The very, very first act, the first scene, Lear's trying to do two things that I don't even know if a king can actually do. Last big theme, hierarchy. Shakespeare's world, everything had a place and an order. The young were supposed to respect the old. Royals and nobles were above non-royals and non-nobles. Unfortunately, women had to always respect and obey men, and everybody had to obey the king. When those rules, when those hierarchies were in place, everything was good, everything was fine, life was wonderful, life was hunky-dory, no problems. When those hierarchies start to get broken in King Lear, awful, terrible things happen. The world sort of falls apart and collapses in upon itself. Hierarchies, order, a good thing. When those hierarchies and orders start breaking down, we got problems. This is the last thing. This is not technically a big theme, but as much as I hate talking about this, I don't hate talking about it, Shakespeare has this reputation as being like the paragon, the greatest writer in the history of the English language. And where does that come from? People who study this type of thing have kind of identified two things that make Shakespeare's writing a cut above everybody else. One is he has this knack for running two parallel plots, two plots at the same time that eventually converge and come together, and they kind of reflect and bounce off of each other. In our play Lear, the main plot is going to be Lear and his daughters. The parallel plot is going to be Gloucester and his two sons. And they parallel because each of them, Lear screws over the wrong daughter. Gloucester believes the wrong son, so it's parents trusting the wrong kids, and they parallel each other that way. But eventually they come together and they fit together perfectly. And Shakespeare does this in pretty much, he also does this in Hamlet, does this in a lot of his plays. The other thing, and I think this actually accounts for Shakespeare's genius more than anything else, he has this knack for taking the public and political and making it personal. On one level, King Lear is a very, very political play. It's about a king dividing up his kingdom, who takes over a kingdom. Is that relatable to most people? No. Most people today, most people back in Shakespeare's day were not noble. They were not royal. So all these Game of Thrones type, who gets to be in power, who gets to be in charge, that's not relatable. But at the same time, Lear is a family drama. It's about sibling rivalry. It's both plots about sibling rivalry. The Lear plot and the Gloucester plot are about sibling rivalry. It's about jealousy. It's about parents playing favorites. Is that stuff relatable to most people? Yeah, because everybody has family drama on some level. What Shakespeare manages to do is take something public, take something royal, take something political, and connect it, tie it into, basically make it a family drama. I think the way one of my old professors described it was Shakespeare has this knack of taking the throne room and bringing it into the living room. I think that's a great way of looking at it. So that's your background information on King Lear. And from here on out, we're going to do things a little bit differently. For the next couple, well, the subunits of Module 8, each one is devoted to one act of King Lear. And we're not going to do any interactive videos for King Lear. Instead, we're going to have an extra discussion question. I think for Act 3 you have 3 discussion questions. But instead of one discussion question, we're going to add an extra discussion question, drop the interactive video. And instead of doing my little introductory and wrap-up videos for each act, what I did the last time I taught this, and the students said it worked out really well, was rather than doing that, I gave reading notes for each act of King Lear. Things to look out for, little summaries, little explanations, basically a transcribed version of my little videos. And the students said that actually worked out better with King Lear. So I'm going to do that with you guys. And if you don't mind, at the end of the semester, let me know which you liked better. Did you like the reading notes, or did you like these little videos that I'm doing? Because like I said, my other class really preferred the reading notes. I'm curious if that was just them, or if that's kind of a universal thing. So if you don't mind, at the end of the semester, shoot me an email. Let me know which you preferred, these videos or the reading notes. Thanks, guys.